In the summer of 1976, life in Circleville, Ohio seemed to continue as it always had, quiet, predictable, and safe. That was until Mary Gillespie, a local school bus driver, received the first of what would become hundreds of threatening letters. The anonymous writer claimed to know intimate details about Mary's life, particularly an alleged affair she was having with the superintendent of schools, Gordon Massey. The letters weren't just accusatory, they were menacing, promising dire consequences if Mary didn't end the supposed relationship. These weren't your typical poison pen letters. The writer demonstrated an uncanny knowledge of Mary's daily routines, her family's activities, and even seemed to be watching her house. The letters began appearing not just in Mary's mailbox, but were posted on telephone poles along her bus route, ensuring maximum public humiliation. The writer threatened to expose the alleged affair to the entire community if Mary didn't comply with their demands. Mary's husband, Ron Gillespie, also began receiving letters. The anonymous writer taunted him about his wife's alleged infidelity, pushing him to take action. The psychological toll on the Gillespie family was immense. They tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but the constant arrival of these letters made that increasingly difficult. Both Mary and Ron adamantly denied the affair, but the writer seemed determined to destroy their reputation regardless of the truth. The situation took an even darker turn when Ron Gillespie received a phone call on August 19, 1977. The caller's identity remains unknown to this day, but whatever was said during that conversation prompted Ron to grab his gun and rush out of the house. Hours later, his pickup truck was found crashed into a tree. Ron was dead at the scene. While the official ruling was that he had died in a single car accident, high levels of alcohol were found in his system, unusual for a man who rarely drank. Many suspected that the crash wasn't accidental at all. The letters didn't stop with Ron's death. If anything, they became more frequent and more threatening. The writer now began targeting other members of the community, including Gordon Massey himself and his family. The letters contained personal information that seemed impossible for an outsider to know, leading many to believe the writer was someone within their tight-knit community. Mary's brother-in-law, Paul Freshour, took a particular interest in the case. He began his own investigation, determined to unmask the person who he believed had driven his brother to his death. Paul worked closely with local law enforcement, sharing his findings and theories. The letters seemed to be written by someone with intimate knowledge of the Gillespie family and their connections to the school system. As the investigation continued, the writer began targeting Mary and Ron's children. The psychological warfare expanded to include phone calls where the caller would simply breathe into the phone or make threatening statements before hanging up. The entire Gillespie family lived in constant fear, never knowing where the next letter would appear or what threats it might contain. In 1983, 6 years after Ron's death, Mary Gillespie was driving her regular bus route when she noticed something unusual. A sign posted along her route contained yet another threatening message. As she stopped to remove it, she discovered something that would break the case wide open. The sign was rigged with a crude booby trap, a box containing a loaded gun designed to fire when the sign was removed. The trap failed to work as intended, but it provided investigators with their first real physical evidence. The gun was traced back to Paul Freshour, Mary's brother-in-law, who had been so invested in solving the case. When questioned, Paul vehemently denied any involvement, but handwriting analysis seemed to match his writing to that of the letters. Despite his protests of innocence, Paul was arrested and charged with attempted murder for the booby trap incident. During Paul's trial in 1983, prosecutors painted a picture of a man obsessed with proving his sister-in-law's infidelity, suggesting that he had taken up the letter-writing campaign to torment Mary and expose what he believed to be the truth about his brother's death. The evidence against him seemed compelling. The handwriting analysis, his access to information contained in the letters, and the gun that was registered in his name. The jury found Paul Freshour guilty, and he was sentenced to 7 to 25 years in prison. Many in the community breathed a sigh of relief, believing the nightmare of the Circleville writer was finally over. However, the story was far from concluded. Even with Paul behind bars, the letters continued to arrive in Circleville. They now contained a new message: claims of Paul's innocence and accusations that law enforcement had imprisoned the wrong person. These new letters were postmarked from Columbus, Ohio, despite Paul being incarcerated in Lima, over 100 miles away. Prison officials insisted it would have been impossible for Paul to send these letters, as he was under close supervision and his mail was carefully monitored. Yet the letters bore the same distinctive characteristics as the earlier ones: the same aggressive tone, similar handwriting, and intimate knowledge of the community's affairs. The mystery deepened when letters began arriving at the prison addressed to Paul himself. These weren't just ordinary correspondence, they were taunting messages from someone claiming to be the real Circleville writer. The writer seemed to take pleasure in the fact that Paul was serving time for crimes they had committed. Prison officials were baffled. How could these letters be arriving if they had the actual writer behind bars? The case took another bizarre turn when several local journalists received letters containing details about unsolved crimes in the area. The writer claimed to have knowledge about other criminal activities in Circleville and threatened to expose various community members' secrets. These letters suggested that the writer's agenda extended far beyond tormenting the Gillespie family. They seemed to fancy themselves as some sort of vigilante exposing the town's hidden sins. As the 1980s progressed, the letters began to focus on broader conspiracies, suggesting cover-ups involving local law enforcement and school officials. The writer appeared to have an almost omniscient knowledge of the community's affairs, leading some to speculate that multiple people might be involved. The letters contained information about private conversations, secret meetings, and personal details that seemed impossible for any single person to know. Throughout his imprisonment, Paul Freshour maintained his innocence. He insisted that he was being framed, pointing to the continued arrival of letters during his incarceration as proof. His supporters argued that the handwriting analysis that helped convict him was flawed and that the gun used in the booby trap could have been stolen from his home. Despite these protests, Paul remained in prison, serving his full sentence until his release in 1994. Upon Paul Freshour's release in 1994, the community held its collective breath, wondering if the letters would finally stop, or if their frequency would increase now that he was free. Surprisingly, shortly after his release, the letters ceased completely. This unexpected development added another layer of complexity to an already puzzling case. Some saw it as proof of Paul's guilt, that he had simply chosen to stop writing upon his release to avoid further scrutiny. Others interpreted it differently, suggesting that the real writer had finally achieved their goal of seeing Paul serve a full sentence for crimes he didn't commit. The abrupt end to the letters left many questions unanswered. Who had written the letters while Paul was in prison? How did they obtain such detailed information about the community's private affairs? And perhaps most importantly, what really happened to Ron Gillespie on that fatal night in 1977? The case had grown cold, but its impact on Circleville remained palpable. In the years following his release, Paul Freshour dedicated himself to clearing his name. He gave interviews to local media and true crime enthusiasts, consistently maintaining his innocence. He pointed out numerous inconsistencies in the case against him, including the fact that many of the letters appeared to be written in different handwriting styles. He also questioned how he could have maintained such an extensive letter-writing campaign while under strict prison supervision. Mary Gillespie, who had endured nearly 2 decades of harassment, remained relatively quiet about the case after the letters stopped. She continued her work as a school bus driver, trying to put the traumatic events behind her. The alleged affair with Gordon Massey, which had been at the center of the early letters, was never proven. Both Mary and Gordon maintained that their relationship had been purely professional, suggesting that the writer's initial accusations may have been based on nothing more than malicious gossip. The case attracted renewed interest in the late 1990s, when several true crime authors attempted to investigate the unsolved aspects of the story. They discovered that many of the original letters had been destroyed or lost over the years, making it difficult to conduct new handwriting analysis with modern techniques. However, they did uncover interesting patterns in the letter's content that hadn't been previously noted. One pattern that emerged was the writer's apparent connection to the local school system. The letters contained numerous references to internal school politics and personnel matters that weren't public knowledge. This led some investigators to theorize that the writer might have been a school employee or someone with close ties to the administration. The level of detail in the letters about school operations seemed too specific to have come from an outsider. Another intriguing aspect that came to light was the writer's knowledge of local law enforcement procedures. The letters often referenced ongoing investigations and internal police matters, suggesting the writer might have had connections within the sheriff's department. This could explain how they managed to stay one step ahead of investigators for so many years. The booby trap incident, which had led to Paul's arrest, also raised new questions under further scrutiny. The device itself was surprisingly sophisticated for someone with no known experience in building such mechanisms. Some experts suggested it would have required knowledge of firearms and engineering that Paul Freshour didn't possess. Furthermore, the placement of the trap along Mary's bus route indicated intimate knowledge of her schedule and stopping points. In 2001, Paul Freshour gave what would become his final interview before his death in 2012. In it, he offered a theory that had been forming in his mind throughout his years in prison. He believed the letter campaign was the work of multiple people, a conspiracy involving individuals who had various grudges against different members of the community. This theory would explain the varying handwriting styles, the widespread knowledge of personal information, and the ability to continue the campaign while he was incarcerated. The possibility of multiple writers had never been seriously investigated during the original case. The prosecution had focused solely on proving Paul's guilt, perhaps missing crucial evidence that could have pointed to other suspects. The theory of multiple writers would explain many of the case's inconsistencies, how the letters contained such varied information, how they continued during Paul's imprisonment, and why they showed different handwriting characteristics. Some investigators began to look more closely at the timing of Ron Gillespie's death in relation to the letters. The anonymous phone call that prompted Ron to leave his house that fatal night remained one of the case's most crucial unsolved elements. If the caller wasn't Paul Freshour, as he had always claimed, then who had made that call? And what information was shared that caused Ron to react so drastically? The alcohol in Ron's system at the time of his death also remained a point of contention. Friends and family maintained that Ron rarely drank, especially to excess. This raised the possibility that he might have been forced to consume alcohol, or that his drink had been tampered with before he got behind the wheel. However, without evidence to support these theories, Ron's death remained officially classified as an accident. The case of the Circleville letter writer became a cautionary tale about the power of anonymous harassment and the difficulties in proving authorship of threatening letters. The writer, or writers, had managed to terrorize an entire community for nearly 2 decades, destroy multiple lives, and potentially get away with murder, all while remaining in the shadows. The fact that the letters stopped so abruptly after Paul's release only added to the mystery, suggesting that perhaps the full truth of the Circleville letters might never be known. As the years passed, many of the key players in the case either passed away or moved from Circleville, taking their secrets with them. The town gradually returned to its quiet, predictable routine, but the legacy of the letters lingered. New residents would hear whispered stories about the time when anonymous letters held an entire community hostage to fear, and long-time residents would still occasionally glance nervously at their mailboxes, wondering if one day the letters might return. The impact of the Circleville letter writer case extended far beyond the immediate community, becoming a fascinating study in criminal psychology and small-town dynamics. Criminologists who later examined the case noted several unique aspects that set it apart from typical harassment cases. The writer's ability to maintain their campaign for so long, their extensive network of information, and their apparent immunity to traditional investigative techniques made this case particularly noteworthy. One theory that gained traction in recent years suggests that the writer may have had access to party line telephone conversations, which were still common in rural Ohio during the 1970s and early 1980s. This could explain their seemingly supernatural knowledge of private matters. Party lines allowed multiple households to share the same telephone line, and an enterprising eavesdropper could gather significant intelligence about their neighbors simply by listening in on conversations. The case also highlighted the limitations of forensic science in the 1970s and 1980s. Modern analysts point out that today's forensic techniques, particularly DNA analysis and advanced handwriting analysis software, might have yielded very different results. The original handwriting analysis that helped convict Paul Freshour would likely not meet current scientific standards for evidence in a criminal trial. Another aspect that deserves attention is the social context of the letters. The writer seemed to tap into the underlying tensions and power dynamics of a small, close-knit community. They exploited existing suspicions, rivalries, and hidden resentments, suggesting they had a sophisticated understanding of social psychology. The letters often played on themes of infidelity, corruption, and abuse of power, topics that could quickly turn neighbor against neighbor in a small town. The role of the local media in the case has also been scrutinized. Some journalists who covered the story at the time have since expressed regret about how the case was reported. The sensational nature of the letters and the pressure to break new developments sometimes led to reporting that may have inadvertently aided the writer's campaign of terror. The writers seemed to understand how to manipulate media coverage, often timing their letters for maximum public impact. In the decades since the letters stopped, various amateur sleuths and true crime enthusiasts have attempted to solve the case using modern investigative techniques. They've created detailed timelines, analyzed writing patterns, and attempted to cross-reference the writer's knowledge with potential suspects who had access to the information contained in the letters. While these efforts haven't definitively solved the case, they've uncovered interesting patterns that were overlooked during the original investigation. One pattern that emerged was the writer's apparent connection to local government beyond just the school system. The letters sometimes contained information about upcoming policy changes or personnel decisions before they were publicly announced. This suggested the writer might have had access to government offices or meetings, either directly or through someone who did. The psychological profile of the writer has also been subject to modern analysis. Mental health professionals who have studied the case suggest the writer likely suffered from a combination of narcissistic personality disorder and paranoid tendencies. The need for control, the grandiose sense of purpose, and the persistent paranoid themes in the letters all point to these characteristics. The writer's ability to avoid detection for so long suggests they were highly organized and methodical. They never left fingerprints on the letters, were careful about where they mailed them from, and seemed to understand how to avoid leaving forensic evidence. This level of sophistication has led some investigators to speculate that the writer might have had law enforcement training or experience. The case has become a valuable teaching tool in criminal justice programs, particularly in courses dealing with stalking and harassment. It demonstrates how difficult it can be to track and prosecute anonymous threats, especially in an era before digital surveillance and forensic technology. The case also shows how a determined harasser can exploit the vulnerabilities of a small community's social fabric. The impact on the Gillespie family continued long after the letters stopped. Mary's children grew up under the shadow of the letters, always watching over their shoulders, never quite feeling safe. The psychological trauma of living under constant surveillance and threat affected their relationships, career choices, and general outlook on life. Even today, family members are reluctant to discuss certain aspects of the case, suggesting that some wounds have never fully healed. Paul Freshour's family also continues to advocate for his posthumous exoneration. They maintain that he was a convenient scapegoat for a crime that local law enforcement was desperate to solve. They point to the continuing letters during his incarceration as irrefutable proof of his innocence, arguing that the real perpetrator was never brought to justice. The case of the Circleville letter writer remains one of Ohio's most intriguing unsolved mysteries. It serves as a reminder of how vulnerable communities can be to psychological warfare, how difficult it can be to prove authorship of anonymous threats, and how the ripple effects of such campaigns can impact generations. Perhaps most disturbingly, it shows how someone with enough local knowledge and determination can terrorize an entire community while hiding in plain sight. As Circleville moves further from these events, the case has taken on an almost mythical quality. It's become part of the town's folklore, a cautionary tale about the power of secrets and the price of silence. Yet for those who lived through it, the memory of those letters arriving in the mail, each one containing another threat or revelation, remains all too real. The truth about the Circleville letter writer may be lost to time, but the lessons learned from this case continue to resonate in an age where anonymous harassment has found new platforms in the digital world.